All right. Should we pick up from where we left off?
Could we work on maybe some of the stuff like the? Let's see. Let me find which one I want to work on.
Well, I tell you what, hold on. Let's work on 15 and 16 because I see a problem you're making here that you don't need to make, and I can clean it up for you really easily.
For wait,
The one that's
which
on
worksheet were we on?
the one you're looking at on my page, 15?
Well, I know, but which worksheet was it?
I don't know. They're all in a
Just go
row.
to the top real quickly.
They're all in a row for me. So 6-1 to 6-4.
Okay, let's find that.
Just want to make a few statements
All right.
about 15 and 16.
Okay.
15 is the sum of perfect cubes. Okay? So if you look over here on the right, that's what a cubed plus b cubed means. Okay? And it factors into those two factors. The mistake you're making on this is that you're not taking the cube root of that first term. In other words, a is always going to be the cube root of the first term. So what's the cube root of 125x cubed? It's 5x, not 125x.
Yeah, that was from a while ago.
Doesn't matter. It's a principle you have to know.
Yeah.
Also, b is the cube root of 216. So that number is 6. So if I want to write a plus b, I'm going to write 5x plus 6. That's what a plus b is. And then whatever that comes out to be, go ahead and figure it out. But the thing you need to do as your first step on problems like this is to define a and b. Now on 16, I see you make this mistake a lot also. So let's clarify this. You got the hard part correct. You got it down to this. All of that equals 0. Okay? So what that tells you is either that's equal to 0 or that's equal to 0. So if I say x squared minus 5 equals 0, that means x squared equals 5. That means x equals plus or minus the square root of 5. And you got very, very close. You got x equal plus or minus the square root, but you put a negative 5.
Yeah.
And I see you make that mistake a lot. In other words, a very, very strong principle of algebra, if this is a factor, then x equals 7 is a 0, not minus 7.
Yeah.
In other words, if that's a factor, then x minus 7 equals 0, and you have to solve that to get that.
Yep.
All right. You tell me where you want to go next.
Okay, could we, okay, I'm just gonna put this stuff away. Could we go to 6.5 to 6.7?
Okay. Not sure where that is. That probably was where I was at.
It's not on the Chapter 6 test. It's a different.
How do I find it? Is it on this document?
Yeah, it is.
Well,
It's in no particular order.
all right. Hold on. Let me scroll up. That was 7. Is it under Chapter 2 test?
No, it's 6.5 to 6.7.
All right.
That's what it says in the title.
Well, this is 3.1 to 3.2.
I don't know, maybe she didn't scan it.
This is Chapter 6, Test A.
She must have not scanned
And
it.
we've done all the ones prior to this.
Yeah, I don't know, she must have just, let's just...
Can you
Yeah, let's just...
Can you verbalize it? Are they problems?
No, it's fine. Let's just do the next one after Chapter 6 test.
So not the one that I'm on the page right now?
We already did that, didn't we?
No,
Yeah.
we did not do that.
We did that.
We did.
I have, like, the answers to it right here.
Well, at least we didn't do it this morning. We might have done it prior to today.
I think we did do it this morning.
Okay. Oh,
Let's just go to the thing after this.
I don't really care. I'll go to anywhere you want. Chapter 2 test?
Yeah, sure.
All right. So let's see what happened on number 2. So you got minus 39 is less than the quantity 1 minus 5p is less than or equal to minus 19. You basically solve this like it's a 2-part inequality instead of 3-part. Okay?
Okay.
What I'm going to try to do is get p all by itself. So what's the first thing I got to do to get p all by itself?
Get it, like,
Let's get rid of that 1. We got a 1 there that we don't need. So I have to subtract 1 from both sides. Make sure you follow what I'm doing.
Got it.
Okay? Now I have to divide both sides by -5 in order to get rid of the -5. And when I divide by a negative number on inequalities, I have to turn the sign around. So I got minus 40 divided by minus 5 and got to switch that. It's going to be p there. I got to switch that also. That's minus 20 divided by minus 5. So the answer is 8 is greater than p, which is greater than or equal to 4. In other words, you solve it just like you would any 2-term inequality, and the goal is to isolate p, just like any equation. That's the goal. Now, one of the things I see you did here is when you subtracted 1 from 39, you got minus 38. Well, you're dead at that point. There's no way you're getting the right answer at that point. You're losing 3 points immediately because you didn't subtract 1 correctly.
Yeah.
You cannot recover from those kind of mistakes. You just can't. That's the nature of mathematics. There were 1, 2, 3, 4 steps to that. If you get any of them wrong, you're dead. All right, let's talk about absolute values. Well, hold it. It looks like you got this one right. All right, let's go to the next one. Number 4.
Yeah.
This is not a continuous function. What this is a series of 3 points. If I plot these points, I got 2 minus 1, that's the first one. I got minus 2 minus 5, that's the second one. And I got 1 comma 2 is the third one. Okay? So if I were to connect those points, I would have a regular looking function, graph.
Yeah, true.
Well, the domain is all of the possible x values. What are all of the possible x values?
2, -2, and 1.
Correct. So she added the 1 for you. That's why you lost a point there. And the range values you got correct. The only reason you lost a point is because you neglected that 1 right there. Actually, looks like you did pretty good on this test. Oh, wow? Is that what that says?
Yeah.
All right, number 12. Whenever you're trying to write the equation of a line, what's the first thing you want to know?
The what you want to know?
Slope. The
Yeah.
very first word, slope. That's the most important thing by far. And it doesn't matter how high you go in mathematics. You can go to calculus or differential equations, and slope is the most important thing there is. Okay? So whenever you're trying to figure out the equation of a line, figure out the slope first of all. Well, they said that it's perpendicular to y equal minus 5, which is that line right there. So what is the slope of a perpendicular line to that?
Like 0.
Well, it's undefined, not 0. The slope of the original line, y equal minus 5, is 0. But when you take the slope of a vertical line, it's basically infinite, okay? But the equation is going to be x equals something. There isn't going to be any y in it, okay? So what is the x going to equal if it goes through the point minus 2 comma 4?
-2.
That's it, right there. That's the answer. Now, I didn't draw my line correctly. In other words, the line needs to be drawn over here at minus 2. But notice that that line is perpendicular to the line they gave you, y equal minus 5, and it goes through that point, minus 2 comma 4. But the only point you really care about is that x coordinate, minus 2. That's what gives you the equation.
Hmm.
16?
Yeah.
All right. When you are graphing inequalities, start out by graphing them as equality. That's the easiest thing to do.
Okay.
Okay, so let's first of all turn that into an equality, graph it. Well, no, let's solve it for y first. Solve this thing for y. Because if we're going to graph it, in y equal mx plus b format, then we need to have it in terms of y. So
Yeah.
solve this for y.
You move the x over.
So I got minus 5y is greater than minus x minus 20. Now what?
Then divide the entire thing by -5.
And because you're dividing by a negative number, what do you have to do to that
Flip the side.
inequality? Switch it. So it now becomes this, and that becomes x over 5 plus 4. See how I got that?
Yep.
Now you're graphing it. You're going to start at plus 4. Got a slope of 1/5, positive 1/5. So it's going to be a graph something like that. And it's going to be a dotted line because it's less than only, not less than or equal. If it were less than or equal, it would be a solid line.
Yeah.
Which side of the graph do I shade?
You shade the bottom.
Yeah, in other words, you always look to the y-axis. The y-axis is the only thing that matters here. And since y has to be less than this line, pick any point you like that's less than the line, and that's the side you shade. So the first thing you have to do is figure out how to draw the line. Second thing you have to do is figure out whether it's a dotted line or a solid line. And the third thing you have to do is figure out which side to shade. We need to do these?
No, if there's nothing wrong, then we don't have
Well, it doesn't look like, oh, okay. So you did them, they're right, okay. So number 20. Come it says plus 1 at the bottom and plus 4. Oh, because these are extra credit.
It's number 20 extra credit?
Well, it's got a plus, oh no, it's got a minus 3. I see. The minus 3 combined with the plus 4 gave you plus 1. Okay, so maybe not.
Okay, let's do number 20.
Number 20, okay. What is the general equation that describes distance, rate, and time? You cannot begin this problem without that equation.
I don't remember.
Dirt.
Slope?
Dirt. D equals RT. The way I remember that is dirt.
Okay.
Distance equals the rate times the time. In other words, if you want to go 60 miles and you're going 60 miles per hour and you're going for 1 hour, there you go. It's going to take you 1 hour to go if your car speedometer is on 60 miles per hour, you're going to go 60 miles in that 1 hour. So if you ever forget what this equation is, make sure that it applies to a scenario that you're very familiar with, that you can figure out.
Okay.
All right. Now, let's see. So he traveled to the cabin on the lake and back. Well, that means the distance is to the cabin and back. So let's call the distance to the cabin equals the rate that he was going to the cabin times the time it took him to get to the cabin.
Okay.
And now it took 1 hour less to get back than it took 1 hour less time to get there than it did to get back. So if it took 1 hour less to get there, it took 1 hour more to get back. Well, the distance is the same thing from the cabin to his home as it is from his home to his cabin. The rate's different. That's the rate coming home, but the time is 1 hour more. So it's the time it took to get to his cabin plus 1. With me?
Yep.
Since the distance to the cabin is the same as the distance to his home, then I can set that equal to that. And I get the rate that he drove going to the cabin times the time that he drove going to the cabin is equal to the rate that he drove back home times the time to the cabin plus 1. Because it took him 1 hour more to get home than it did going to the cabin. That's what it took, 1 hour less to get there than to get back. It means it took 1 hour more to get back. Okay? So, how many hours did the trip take? Well, that's basically T sub C plus T sub C plus 1, right? So I got to solve for some of these variables. Well, the next thing it tells me is that the average speed on the trip was 40 kilometers per hour. Well, if the average speed on the trip is 40 kilometers per hour, I'll start with the back. Hold on. How many hours did the average speed on the way back was 30. So the distance to home, which is the same as the distance to the cabin, was the rate on the way home, which is 30, times the time it took him to get to the cabin plus 1. So I know that equation. That's what the average speed on the way back is 30 means. The average speed on the total trip was 40. Well, if the average speed on the total trip, which is 2 distances, equals 40 times the 2 times, added together, that's 2t sub c plus 1. So I can solve this equation for d sub c, and it equals 20 times 2t sub c plus 1. Sorry to make this so complicated, but it's a complicated problem. Okay? Now, notice that that distance has to be equal to that distance. And that leaves me one variable only. I get this amount here has to be equal to that amount there because they're both equal to the distance to the cabin. So I get 30 t sub c plus 30 equals 40 t sub c plus 20. There's only one variable in that. I can solve for the time it took to get to the cabin. I got 10 t sub c equals 10. So the time it took to get to the cabin is 1 hour. How many hours did the trip take? How many hours did the trip there take? Well, that's t sub c. 1 hour. Now, these distance, rate, time problems are probably some of the toughest word problems you'll ever run across. And the way to solve these is always, always start with your general equation. You really cannot get anywhere if you don't start with that.
Yeah.
Excuse me, hold on. All right. And then you have to kind of take this distance equals rate time and turn it into two trips. In other words, you had the trip to the cabin, and then you had the trip coming back. And the only thing we know about those two trips was that the distance was the same. So that's why I called that distance to the cabin, the rate to the cabin times the time to the cabin. That's actually the distance to come home, but it's the same as the distance to the cabin, so I left it as d sub c. And that's the rate that we come home times the time, and it took us an hour longer to get home. And then you kind of go from there, plugging in everything they give you, and hopefully you'll get it down to one variable and one equation, which we do at this point right there. And immediately that allows me to solve for the time to the cabin.
We'll see what's next on the...
All right. What does not done mean?
That means I didn't finish it like in the class period.
The whole thing? So I can keep going down until I see minus? So the first one we need to cover is 3?
Huh?
The first one we need to cover is 3?
Yeah.
All right. This is just like before, where we had a middle term that contains the variable, and we have to solve this. It's the first step in solving this.
Getting the variable by itself.
Right. Okay. So what's the first step in doing that?
In this case, it would be getting the r, like the -3 on.
Yeah, you got to get rid of that before you can get rid of that. See why? It looks like the first thing you did was divide by -3, and that actually works. It should work, but it's not the most efficient way to go. In other words, you always get rid of everything that's being added or subtracted first before you divide by that coefficient. So if I add 3 to both sides, I get this. Don't have to turn that around yet because I'm just adding numbers. With me?
Yep.
Now you divide by 3. -3, excuse me. I divide that by -3, that by -3, that by -3, and I turn around the direction of both of those because I'm dividing all 3 sides by a negative number. So now I get 4 greater than or equal to r greater than or equal to 1. There's your answer. And graphing that, there's 1, there's 4, so it's between 1 and 4, and they're both greater than or equal, so it's that line. Open or close dot at the end of that line?
Close.
Now I notice your answer was between 2 and 5, so you couldn't have been that wrong. It looks like I think you made your mistake because you divided by -3 first. And that left you with the r plus 1 there. And you never moved the 1. So you ended up with r plus 1 is greater than or equal to 2 and less than or equal to 5. But you really need to subtract 1 from both sides. with this problem, you could actually have done it the way you did it, only you just didn't finish the last step.
Oh.
But it's always better to get rid of the numbers that are being added or subtracted first. Number 4. To be able to do this, you need to know what this means. What does this mean?
The absolute value of x is greater than...
It means two things. What two things does it mean?
The absolute value of x is
Well,
greater...
eliminate the absolute value. So it means x is greater than 10, or what?
Or,
For the
x.
For the second part, you have to do two things. You have to change the direction, and you have to change the signs on the number. So that's what this means. Okay?
Okay.
And if you know what this means, then you have to use the same exact logic on your problem. So what two things does this mean?
The absolute value of...
Well, eliminate the absolute value. And that's what you did. I can see your work here. In other words, the first thing it means is 4 minus 8m is greater than or equal to 4, or 4 minus 8m is less than or equal to negative 4. In other words, the very first thing you write is everything you see just without the absolute value. That's a piece of cake there. Doesn't matter what's inside or what this number is over here. That's the first thing. The second thing, you have to do two things. Never change what's inside the absolute value, but you have to change the direction and the sign. And now you have two inequalities to solve for. And you do those vertically. So let's solve for those vertically. It's the first thing you do. In other words, now I'm going to go down.
So you got to get them by itself.
Got to isolate m. Isolate m.
So you subtract 4.
Okay, that's first step.
Which equals 0.
Okay. Now what do you do?
Then you divide it by negative 8, which is still 0.
Right. So really, m has to equal 0. There's no other solution. Excuse me. No. I'm sorry. I'm wrong. Wow. M, if I use my rules and I divide both sides by negative 8, I get m, which the sign, 0. And is that correct? In other words, if m is any negative number, is that statement true?
Yeah.
Yeah, it is. And m has to be either a negative number or equal to 0 for that statement to be true. So the fact that 0 is on one side doesn't change anything. I'm still going to divide both sides by a negative number and turn the sign around. Okay? So now doing this one over here on the right, what do you get?
You get negative... No, you get 1 equals m.
Well, if I subtract 4 from both sides, I'm left with minus 8 over there instead of 0.
1 is, m is greater than or equal to 1.
All right. So if I graph that, there's 0, there's 1. This part, closed dot, goes in that direction. This part, closed dot, and goes in that direction. And that's the graph. How come that looks like what you did?
Yeah, I think I got the signs wrong in when I wrote the answer down.
Oh, you had m is less than or equal to 1.
And I didn't write it in the notation.
All right. Interesting that you got the signs wrong, but you drew the graph correct. All right. Let's look at 5. What does it mean if I'm asking what h of 4/3 is? How am I going to get that?
You have to divide everything by that.
Well, you're going to plug in 4/3 for x.
Yeah.
Which is what it looks like you tried to do, only you wrote the wrong exponent there. You wrote a 2 instead of a 3. So the best way to do these problems so you do not make a mistake is one step at a time. I'm going to put in minus 2. I'm going to put in 4/3. I'm going to cube it. And I'm going to add 4/3 times 4/3. In other words, wherever I see x, I substitute 4/3. Now is all I got to do is simplify that. And you don't really want to do it in a decimal format. Leave everything as fractions, at least until you get to the end. So I got minus 2. What is 4/3 cubed?
8/3?
That's, you got a cube numerator and denominator. What's 4 cubed?
Oh, cubed. 64? Is that right?
What's 3 cubed?
It would be 27.
Okay. And then let's do this part. What's 4/3 times 4/3?
4/3 times 4/3 would be 16 over 9.
Okay. Now, to add those two fractions together, let's multiply the minus 2 first. So I got minus 128/27. If I turn this into 27ths, it becomes 48/27. In other words, if I multiply top and bottom by 3, now I can combine those two fractions, and I have minus 80 divided by 27, and I don't think I can reduce that any. That's the answer. All right, let's see. Where's the next one that you got points off? Is it on this page? I don't see anything that I'm looking at that have a minus. In other words, you lost 2 points on 5. It doesn't look like 6. What'd you lose here? It looks like minus 1/7.
Yeah, I didn't lose anything there.
Okay. How about 8? You did good on that. Oh, 9. I see minus 3.
And 8.
And 8? Okay, let's look at 8. Hold on a minute. Decide whether line 1 and line 2 are parallel, perpendicular, or neither. What's that based on? What's the only thing we need to know about lines 1 and line 2 to answer that question?
The slope.
Correct. So what is the slope of line 1?
1.
You got -1 minus 3, which is -4. And then you got -6 minus 1, which should be -7. So you should have got -4 over -7, which is 4/7.
Oh.
Correct? I didn't do my math wrong, did I?
I don't think so.
No, -1 minus 3 is -4. And -6 minus 1 is -7. So this -5, that looks like her writing.
Yeah.
Looks to me like she misinterpreted what you were doing. In other words, you actually wrote it correctly. -1 minus 3 divided by -6 minus 1. No, not quite. You didn't. Okay. Here, I made a mistake when I looked at it. You got to make sure your arithmetic is correct. -1 minus 3 is the difference in the y's. The difference in the x's is -6 minus a minus 1. Correct?
Yeah.
That becomes -4 over -5, which becomes 4/5. So that is the slope of line 1. What's the slope of line 2? Let's see, I'll do it the same way. You got 2 minus 7 over -8 minus a minus 12. Again, it looks like you dropped a negative sign. One of the biggest hazards in doing algebra is dropping negative signs. Everybody has a tendency to do it, particularly when you have two of them together like this. In other words, you really wanted to do -8 minus a minus 12. But what you wrote was -8 minus 12. Well, that's not going to give you the same answer. That's -5 there, but it's +4 there. So that's the slope of line 2. Now, are the lines parallel, perpendicular, or neither?
They are perpendicular. Yeah,
Yes.
perpendicular.
Yeah, absolutely. Because the slope of one line is the negative reciprocal of the slope of the other. So the only reason you missed this problem wasn't that you didn't understand it. You understood it perfectly. It was that you made arithmetic errors, pre-algebra errors. Now, if you're using a calculator, you shouldn't be making those. If you're doing them in your head, then you can easily make a mistake. But there's nothing on this that you didn't understand. You just made a mistake with your math. Those are the one kind of mistakes that you can avoid. It's hard to avoid mistakes when you don't understand the problem. But when you understand the problem and still get it wrong, that means you're making a mistake where you had no business making a mistake.
Yeah.
All right, number 9. Rate of change is the same as slope. This is why the word slope is so important, whether you're in algebra, precalculus, or calculus, is because what it means is the rate of change. Okay? So if I'm trying to figure out the rate of change, I'm looking for the difference in the population divided by the number of years. Well, what's the difference in the population?
Um,
Between 2 parts per million and
it's like 1.6, no, 0.6 parts per million.
okay. How many years is that over?
Um, like 6.
What fraction is that?
1982 over
No, we got the answer, but we don't see that answer on there. So we got to convert this into a different number. What is 0.6 divided by 6 equal?
0.1.
Correct? Or 1/10? That answer is on there. Understand?
Yep.
Number 11. That negative sign that she circled, that means it's a negative slope. That line you drew, is that a positive or a negative slope?
Um, that is negative.
No, that's a positive slope that you.
Oh, what I drew, yeah, it's negative.
Well, it can't be right if you're drawing a positive slope and you're seeing a negative slope. It doesn't matter. Nothing else matters, is it's not going to be right. Okay.
Right.
So you go ahead and start from your y-intercept, which you did. That's fine. But then you have to apply the slope right. In other words, you do have to go down 3 and over 2, which you did, but then you didn't connect those two. In other words, your line should have connected that point with that point. And that would have been correct and a slope of minus 3/2. I'm going to draw a bunch of slopes. You tell me whether they're positive or negative.
It's positive. Positive. Negative.
So you know your slopes. What's this one?
Like, no, it's like undefined.
Zero. No, that's 0. The horizontal lines are 0. The vertical lines are undefined. And what undefined means is infinite. Because if I'm drawing slopes, there's a slope of 1.
Yeah.
There's a slope of 2. There's a slope of 10. By the time I get to a vertical line, it's infinity. And they don't like using the words infinity, so they say undefined. But notice that if I go the other direction, there's a slope of 1/2. There's a slope of 1/10. By the time I get to the horizontal line, that slope is 0. And
Yeah.
there's a huge difference between 0 and infinity. So the only thing I would say here is when you finish drawing your line, make sure that the sign of the slope is correct. Because you got everything right on here, you just got the negative sign wrong. Hold on. Sorry. don't. Not that good with Windows 10. On 13, they want the slope-intercept form of the equation that goes through a given point with a given slope. There is no question in algebra that is more common than this, where they give you a point and a slope. So the general equation in slope-intercept form is y equal what?
Mx plus b.
Tell you the slope, so you can substitute that for m.
Yeah.
Now the only thing we need to come up with the equation of the line is b. If we had b, we'd have it. Well, they tell us that it goes through the point 3, 3. So what can we do to solve for b?
Plug it in.
Okay, so y is 3. X is 3. That lets us solve for b. Those 3's cancel, subtract 8 from both sides. I get b equals minus 5. Now I've got my full equation. 8/3 x minus 5. So your answer is always going to have a y and an x in it, but it's never going to have an m or a b in it. You're going to substitute numbers for m and b.
Yeah.
This is pretty interesting. You actually used the most efficient way to do the problem, which is the point slope format, which is what you wrote here. The only thing is you didn't convert it properly. In other words, because she requested slope-intercept, this would normally be a good answer, what you gave. Y minus 3 equals 8/3 of x minus 3. That's a perfectly acceptable answer normally. The only reason that's not acceptable here is because she specifically asked for it in slope-intercept format, which means this.
Yeah.
Point slope is this. Any equation can have either format. This is just as valid as any other format. And this is what you use, which is actually the most efficient way to do it. You immediately get y minus 3 equals 8/3 times x minus 3. And that's your answer. That would normally be an acceptable answer. But in this case, you have to move this 3 on the other side and distribute everything before you can put it into y equal mx plus b format. It looks like you tried to do that, but again, you made some arithmetic errors. I'm seeing a lot of your mistakes are not lack of understanding. They are arithmetic errors. Sam, I got to go. It's 4 o'clock.
Okay, sounds good.
All right. If I'll try to make a note of where we left off. If you want to pick up from where we left off, question 14 is where we need to start from.
Okay, sounds good.
All right, Sam. Talk to you later. Bye-bye.
Okay, see ya.